In this video, I'll be talking about how to answer an exam question on Gerald from an Inspector Calls. Just a reminder, I tend to focus on the exam requirements for Edexcel, IGCSE English Literature. But if you could be here from AQA or CIE, if you're here to really understand Gerald in great detail, then you've come to the right place. Just be mindful for Edexcel, you don't have to talk that much about context. That's a little different for AQA, so please keep that in mind. Okay, if you get a question on Gerald, you should know these basic things about him. He is the son of Sir George and Lady Croft of Crofts Limited. He's around 30. He's neither young or old, so he's kind of perfectly set in the middle of Sheila and Eric and Mr. Burling and Mrs. Burling. He's engaged to marry Sheila Burling, and he's considered her social superior, which we learn his mother's not so happy that he's marrying beneath himself. He has an affair with who he thought was Daisy Renton, who we learn is actually Eva Smith, the summer before, and that's why the inspector wants to speak to him. And in the end, he's the one that really kind of raises the question of whether the inspector was genuine or not. And he shows no remorse by the end of the play. We see a little bit of that in the middle, but it goes very quickly by the end. And we'll talk about what that truly reveals about his character and what he represents. So we have to think throughout our answer, what is Priestley using this character for, right? He doesn't just create characters for the sake of it, to fill the stage. He is using Gerald to represent the deeply ingrained exploitative nature of the upper class. And I think it's important, the phrase deeply ingrained, because what he's trying to highlight to the audience through Gerald is the upper class are never going to change. It is almost like their nature, it's innate, it's almost in their blood. They're never going to change. It's just in them to be selfish. They don't care, they never will. And there's almost this argument of, if you want things to change, don't look at the upper class to change things, because they want to preserve everything, because life's going really well for them. We'll obviously look at that in greater detail. I have this in every video. Please skip it. If you've looked at my other videos, I pretty much say the same thing. But just a reminder, J.B. Priestley, who wrote the play, he's a socialist. So you are going to see very kind of anti-capitalist ideas laid out through the play. And this is all really to promote the idea of socialism, okay? Because J.B. Priestley was definitely pro-socialism. And so therefore it's a morality play with elements of melodrama. Like I said, for Edexcel, you don't have to talk about context at length. It's not in the mark scheme at all. Occasionally it is useful to talk about context, just in the way of explaining what Priestley intended for the audience. Because remember, he wrote the play for audiences in 1945 specifically, not for us. He doesn't know what our lives were going to look like and what our norms and values would be. But he absolutely knows what 1945 looks like. So a reminder, he's writing in 1945. This is when the play is first viewed. And the actual play is written in 1912. So what the audience know that the characters on stage do not know is that there will be the sinking of the Titanic. And that just creates this distrust really for these industrialists, for the upper classes, for the wealthy, who seem to know everything. And, you know, they put this big ship, the Titanic, out and very, very confidently say it won't sink, and it does. And there's just kind of really, I guess, a message there, a wider message of, you know, we shouldn't trust these people in power who have a lot of money and just assume they know best. There's also 2 world wars that this audience have gone through since 1912. So when they're watching these people on stage who are privileged, feeling very secure about their future, very pleased with themselves, they're thinking in their heads, you have no idea what's ahead of you. Something to consider about Gerald is he potentially would be someone, because he is a bit older, he potentially wouldn't be sent to the war. And would be running one of the factories, maybe changing the factories to produce something that would be useful for the war. He's one of the few that may actually come out of this laughing, in the sense that he would have made a lot of money. But again, we don't have to, I'm kind of going off on a tangent, and you really don't have to talk about that for Edexcel. But the point is, I'm just trying to get you into the mindset of the audience, right? There could be, especially if the audiences are not from the upper class, there's going to be a sense of anger and hatred potentially for the upper class. We've got the suffragette movement. We've got a different mindset amongst women, and a different mindset just amongst the community when looking at women. Okay, women had to take on quote unquote male roles while the men went off to fight the war. They come back. They recently have the vote, and they want things to change. I'm not saying it's certainly not perfect in 1945, but they certainly do not want it to go back to that rigid patriarchal structure of 1912. They also had the Great Slump in the 1930s, otherwise known as the Great Depression. And we have a ton of worker strikes, because why did the majority of working class die in the world wars, right? We have more people dying from the working class than any other class in these world wars. Why would they come back and accept the injustices that are so obvious in this capitalist society? And so I'm just giving you an idea. The audience are coming to this play potentially with already that kind of mindset. Another reminder for Edexcel, you have to include language, form, and structure in your analysis. So I use these colours to indicate where I'm talking about all three. You do not have to talk about the three of them equally, but you do need to have a range of those references in your answer. So keep that in mind. Okay. And remember, there's a lot of quotes on each slide. I'm not expecting you to include all of this in a response under time conditions, but this at least gives you an idea of some things that you might want to explore. And you, of course, may have some different quotations that you think would be better to highlight a different point. The first thing I would say, I would focus on his social class. It is clear from the get-go, and it's important that we know from the get-go, that he is of a high social rank. He's aristocratic, right? He's described in the opening stage directions as a well-bred young man about town. So let's have a look and pick that apart. If you look at the adjective well-bred, we get this image of him being a refined man with good manners, well presented, not just in terms of the way he's dressed, but the way he carries himself, educated, so well spoken. So displaying all those qualities that are associated with a high social rank. It also implies being well bred, so gives this image of him being cultivated from a really young age, of knowing how to present himself, okay, and knowing how to behave and holding the right attributes and attitudes of the aristocracy. And I think that foreshadows how difficult it will be for Gerald to break away from those norms and values of the upper class, okay? We may see snippets of hope, but in the end, he does not change whatsoever. And I would argue it's going to be harder for him than anyone else, according to Priestley, because he's really trying to highlight that this is really kind of deeply ingrained in the upper class. This is their kind of way of thinking, way of being. He's also described with this phrase, man about town, which really kind of refers to a socialite lifestyle. So what do we take from that? We imagine that he's socially popular, he's going to all the fashionable places, such as the Palace Bar, as we hear a lot about. There is, however, I would argue, a negative undertone to that phrase that hints to a kind of playboy lifestyle, which I know that seems like a modern phrase, but actually playboy would have been used back then as well, or that idea of a playboy lifestyle would have been understood as someone who is, I guess, using their money to seek enjoyment through drink, through going out, through socializing, through sex as well, right? And we're going to come to that in a minute, how it's quite normal for those upper class men to use prostitution. And of course, this foreshadows his affair with Eva Smith. We know that he's aristocratic because of how his parents are mentioned. They are called Sir George and Lady Croft. So their titles, Sir and Lady, clearly indicate that they are upper class. I think this is Mr. Burling referring to them, and he uses a lot of dashes, which indicate that he's like speaking about them hesitatingly. He's intimidated by their social rank, and that really is a great example of the discomfort that's created through this rigid class structure, which Priestley hates. So despite, Mr. Burling being a really successful businessman, he feels inferior to the Crofts. We also learn, and this comes with being, part of the aristocracy, that Gerald's wealth is inherited. It's not like Mr. Burling's that is earned. You might say there's an irony there that Mr. Burling feels intimidated when he's earned his money and come from nowhere, whereas this family have just simply inherited it. But yes, his mom is described as from an old country family, landed people. It's only natural, and this is about her feeling upset about him Gerald marrying below his social rank. So the adjective landed indicates that he has this aristocratic background, it's inherited wealth. And it's interesting that it's referred to as only natural that she's upset about Gerald marrying Sheila, because natural implies that there's this that her sense of superiority and snobbery is innate, and it's something that can't be helped. So again, there goes this idea that Priestley's trying to push about the upper class. It's like it's in their blood. They're never going to change, okay? It's the core of them. So he's certainly saying there's no hope with the upper class. Let's give up on the upper class. We want change. We're going to have to make that change. So he's foreshadowing here that, again, that Gerald's going to be unable to change. His aristocratic values are far too deeply embedded within him. And so therefore, hope does not lie with the upper class. And then with this aristocratic background comes the sense of superiority and a sense of respectability, which we see in Gerald saying to the inspector, we're respectable citizens and not criminals. Like, why on earth are you here? You're in the wrong place. Why are you questioning us? And so his own snobbery is evident in that declarative sentence, because we've got this sense of moral superiority. The juxtaposition of respectable citizens and criminals indicates that he thinks those two things are mutually exclusive. In other words, you can't be of a high social rank and be a criminal. Impossible. Those things don't go together. So that already implies that he looks at these lower social classes, particularly the working class, as more likely to have criminals amongst them. But over the course of the play, of course, Priestley explores the hypocrisy of this belief. And what we do see is all of this family on stage are anything but respectable citizens. And some of them, or I should say one of them, Eric, is a criminal. I would also personally look at how he is very detached in many ways. First of all, looking at his marriage to Sheila, we learn that this marriage is actually transactional. It's not really a love-based marriage, which would be very normal for that time for this class. So we learn this because Burling says in his speech, we may look forward to the time when Crofts and Burlings are no longer competing but are working together. So this marriage is the perfect business opportunity for two business competitors to come together and become even wealthier. So it's all about, this marriage is only really about securing and building on their wealth. And this is further supported when we learn that Gerald doesn't come near Sheila the summer before. So we already know there's no real desire in Gerald to be with her. At least the last summer there was no desire. Looking at the way Gerald agrees with Mr. Burling, he says, I think you're right, sir. This is talking about how to behave, how to be in business, how to treat your employees. You couldn't have done anything else. This is about Eva Smith. There was absolutely nothing. It was completely out of your hands. So he's absolutely aligned with Mr. Burling. So his dialogue on business practice draws those parallels, and it indicates that Gerald really is a capitalist to the core, and he prioritizes profit over human well-being. So it's hard to actually say if he is closer to Sheila and Eric or he is smack bang in the middle. But we may have expected him, as a modern audience, we see age 30 as much younger than maybe it is was seen in 1945. But, you know, whether he's in between or closer in age to Sheila and Eric, he's ideologically aligned with Mr. and Mrs. Burling. And that, of course, further exemplifies Priestley's argument that the capitalist ideology is too deeply embedded in the upper class and it will never change if we depend on them to change anything. The use of the declarative in his speech, saying that Mr. Burling couldn't have done anything different, gives Gerald a sense of conviction, like he knows what's best, right? What practice is best. So for him, there's no room for compassion in business. That's the way he sees it. And of course, this exposes the flaws of capitalism, according to Priestley. And this really sets him apart from Sheila and Eric. You could argue he is the antithesis of them, the direct opposite. They demonstrate critical thinking when they contradict their father's actions. And he doesn't. He's completely aligned with them. So that really, again, highlights his incapacity to change. You could go as far, and I definitely think this, that I think Gerald is the worst of all of them. And I think that because he has seen the suffering of the working class up close. He was with Eva Smith for a few months. He spent a lot of time with her during that summer. She relayed to him her suffering. He watched how hungry she was when he first met her. He knew she didn't have any parents to turn to. He knew that she had been sacked, and all the rest. He knew all of that. He saw that suffering up close, and yet it failed to change his perspective. So again, I think that also highlights that detachment. He may say that he was fond of her, that she was charming, but ultimately it did nothing to change him or affect him to the core. And then, of course, when he's talking about his relationship with Eva Smith, he says, I hadn't set eyes on the girl for at least 6 months. I don't come into this suicide business. The phrase, the girl, is vague and dismissive, right? It's not Eva, or for him, Daisy Renton, the girl. And it really strips Eva of her identity. She's just another girl in Gerald's mind. It creates this sense of distance as well, which fails to reflect that intensity in their relationship that I've just talked about. They did spend a lot of time together. They slept together. And it sounds like Eva, if she wasn't in love with him, she felt very, very deeply for him. And it just completely dismisses all of that by just saying that girl or the girl. Referring to her death as this suicide business is completely devoid of emotion, and it reflects how Gerald is much more focused on removing his personal culpability, right? He's much more focused on that. I've got nothing to do with this. That was 6 months before. Okay, he's much more focused on getting away with it, if you like, rather than reflecting on the tragic loss of a human life that he knew. He's clearly a patriarch, especially looking at his interaction with Sheila, and of course, learning about his interaction with Eva Smith. When Sheila receives her engagement ring, she says, "Is it the one you wanted me to have?" Her question and the use of the first person pronoun you highlights who's important in this relationship: Gerald. It's not, do you like it, Sheila? You're going to wear it every day for the rest of your life. How do you feel about that ring? It's all about his desires, right? So this just simply reflects the patriarchal nature of their relationship, that Sheila's wants and desires are less or subordinate to Gerald. You'll realise that men with important work to do sometimes have to spend nearly all their time and energy on their business. You'll have to get used to that, just as I had. That's from Mrs. Burling. And Mr. Burling, when we learn of the affair, tries to justify it by saying to Sheila, but you must understand that a lot of young men. So first of all, with Mrs. Burling, that future tense and those decorative sentences creates this really assured tone that Mrs. Burling is really clear on the defined roles within a marriage, really rigid ideas of what a man and a woman should be within a marriage. Of course, she's also using that modal verb, have to. You're going to have to get used to this. And that reveals Mrs. Burling's belief of what a wife's obligation is. And that's basically, you have to take a passive role in this marriage. And you have to, she doesn't say it, but you could go as far to say and interpret that she's basically saying, You have to accept that your husband's going to have an affair, or many. And of course, what this really does is it normalizes Gerald's dismissiveness of Sheila's needs. She's saying, you didn't hang out with me enough last summer. You didn't give me enough time. And Mrs. Burling is saying, you're just going to have to get used to it. Your needs and desires are not as important as Gerald's. We see this also, but much more obviously in Mr. Burling, when he says, you must understand, and he's about to say, we all know he's about to say, you must understand that a lot of young men have affairs, basically, is what he's about to say. And he indicates that it's Sheila's obligation to accept her husband will have affairs. So again, both Mr. and Mrs. Burling are supporting this patriarchal system, even though this goes against the happiness of Sheila. And it's just, you know what, you're just going to have to accept it. This is the way it is. When talking about his relationship with Eva Smith, he says, I suppose it was inevitable, nearly any man would have done. So the adjective inevitable and the superlative most, I changed the quote. So I guess we wouldn't be looking at the superlative most. But I guess here you would just look at the phrase nearly any man, okay? That's Gerald's attempt at normalizing his behavior and removing accountability. You know, who cares what every other man would do? Let's focus on you, Gerald, and what you did. And Sheila's not happy. Sheila would not accept, okay, that you've been seeing this other girl last summer. But it's interesting, this normalization of it. And, you know, unfortunately, it was common, you might argue, amongst upper class men to use prostitution. And then when, you know, all these more of these details are going to come out, basically Gerald doesn't want his future wife to hear them, but he makes it sound like, you know, he wants to spare her the details of how kind. I think Miss Burling ought to be excused any more of this questioning. She's had a long, exciting and tiring day. How condescending is that? First of all, he's doing exactly what Mr. and Mrs. Burling does, right? In the way that they also are condescending to Sheila. He speaks on her behalf using the third person, and what he's doing there is taking away Sheila's voice. Let her speak for herself. She's actually been very capable, more capable than anyone else, for speaking her own mind. She doesn't need your help, Gerald. One could see why he was drawn to Eva Smith. Right? She's a vulnerable woman who's easily controlled. She's starving, right, when she meets him. She's absolutely desperate. And I think he likes to have that control. And that's truly what drew him, I would argue, to Eva Smith, is that sense that he could fulfill that patriarch role and have that sense of power and control. It's much more about him, I would argue, than it is about helping Eva Smith. So this patronizing depiction of Sheila also exposes how he doesn't know her. He completely underestimates her. And of course, you could say that's because the whole patriarchal system underestimates women and what they're capable of. And the irony is, she, more than anyone on that stage, can handle the truth. She is not afraid to face what she did and her family did and the responsibility they should take. And he's there patronizing her, saying, oh, Sheila should go. Oh, please excuse her. She can't handle this anymore. She's so fragile. And this obviously links quite nicely then into talking about him being a misogynist, okay? We see just the way that he depicts women is really uncomfortable, especially for a modern audience. When he's talking about the sex workers at the bar, he says, I hate those hard-eyed, dough-faced women. I think out of all the quotations, this is the one that makes my blood boil the most. He's quite happy to use prostitutes, and then he speaks of them in that way, like he's above them. This is when I think I know for certain I personally hate Gerald. Of course, you are open to your own interpretation, but let's pick this apart. First of all, we clearly see he has this sense of disgust, right, when he looks at these sex workers, and that's emphasized by the harsh verb hate. Look at how he focuses on their physical appearance, them being hard-eyed, dough-faced. Dough-faced really means kind of like pale. And what he's doing there is objectifying them, and he's failing to recognize actually them being hard-eyed and dough-faced are clear signs of their suffering, right? Those hard eyes reflect their harsh living conditions, might even reflect a sadness, a deep sadness in them. And their dough faces are indicative of malnourishment, right? Their weakness, if they're pale. Priestley highlights the hypocrisy of the upper class here perfectly, right? He's quite happy to use working class women in many ways, in business and in his own sexual gratification. They're very useful to him, but he doesn't want to see them, and he certainly doesn't want to see the effect of that suffering, right? The treatment of how hard it is in those factories, and how hard it is to be dealing with men like him at the Palace Bar, and the likes of Joe Megarty, that turn them hard-eyed and dough-faced. But he doesn't want to see the result of that, okay? So I find that just the most infuriating quote, so I'll move on swiftly before I say something I regret. Next one, he talks about Eva Smith, or of course he calls her Daisy Renton. She was young and fresh and charming. So first of all, looking at that adjective young depicts Eva as innocent and vulnerable, and that highlights, I would argue, the exploitative nature of Gerald. Of course he likes the fact that she's young. He likes to feel like the person in control. And as we talked, we can link that nicely to him being a patriarch. The adjective fresh, I would argue, likens her to a piece of meat, reflecting the disregard of the upper class have of the working class. He describes her personality as charming, and that does contrast her from the other sex workers. And so I think that does indicate there was a greater connection between them. Okay, he did like her as a person, and so there's an inkling of hope there that maybe, you know, he is capable of having some sort of connection with someone from the working class. However, I argue that this makes it even more unforgivable that he is so dismissive and so celebratory by the end of the play. He was able to have some sort of connection with a working class woman, and he is unable to recognise that suffering and understand the part he plays in that and feel any sense of remorse. So for me, it makes him the worst character out of everyone on stage. And then, of course, looking at the word install her, when he says, you know, he put her in those flats, the verb install implies that Gerald views Eva Smith as an object that he can use and disregard when it suits him, and that's basically what he did. Of course, he represents that differently, which we'll look at. I think what is really important, at least for me, arguing about Gerald, because I do have a very negative perception of his character and I'm very cynical of him. And of course, you can certainly view him differently if you like, just make sure that you support it convincingly. But I think deep down he's very dishonest, and I take everything he says with a pinch of salt. You first see that when Sheila clocks on to the fact that he must have had something to do with Eva Smith. She notices he reacts when he hears the word Daisy Renton. And so, you know, she asks him straight up, you know, okay, tell me about it. So when did you meet her? Just be honest with me. And his instinct is to deny it immediately. I didn't. That short sentence reveals that lying for him is instinctive. And I think that's important because it tells the audience to distrust his version of events. And we have to understand everything we learn about his relationship with Eva Smith / Daisy Renton is really through his presentation. And I think we have to take it with a pinch of salt, because I think he's going to do everything possible to paint himself in a positive light. You know, he puts her up in this flat, and he says, it happened that a friend of mine let me have the key of a nice set of rooms. His friend's gone to Canada for 6 months. And I think that is just far too much of a coincidence. Oh, I have this poor lady who needs help, and it just so happens I had these keys to these rooms. The idiom, it happened, sometimes people say, it so happened. It basically means, you know, this was a complete coincidence. And he's trying to say, you know, this detail is of little significance. However, considering that he frequently visits the Palace Bar, which we know is a favourite haunt of women of the town, which he said himself, the audience should question the real intention behind having access to these rooms. And I believe that Gerald was quite used to using sex workers, and his friend thought it'd be very convenient for Gerald to have the room so he could install whoever he wanted in those rooms until he decided it wasn't working for him anymore, which is exactly what he does. But he does at least try to present himself as incredibly upset and moved by this whole revelation to the inspector. He says, "I'm rather more upset by this business than I probably appear to be. And well, I'd like to be alone for a while. I'd be glad if you'd let me go." Gerald's sincerity is up for interpretation here. You could absolutely see this as a true emotional response that's indicated by those dashes, which would, be hesitations in his speech or slight pauses. However, I would argue it's later revealed that Gerald goes to inquire about the inspector once he leaves. He goes and speaks to a police officer friend and finds out there's no Inspector Gall in the local police station. So one might conclude, as I do, that Gerald wanted an excuse to leave to do some investigating of his own. So I would argue that this was a dishonest display of emotion. And that leads me to argue that he, I think, is a very good manipulator. I think we see this in the way that he tries to present his relationship with Eva Smith as something positive. So first of all, he describes her as giving him a glance that was nothing less than a cry for help. She was intensely grateful. And Sheila picks up on this. She realizes, well, this is what you like, isn't it? Oh, yes, you were the wonderful fairy prince. And she's kind of saying it sarcastically. Gerald, also, I haven't used a quote here, but I think he uses the predatory behavior of Joe Megarty to create a contrast to his own involvement with Eva Smith. So he's using really this damsel in distress trope, right? This classic character trait of like this poor, fragile, weak woman who just needs a man to save her. And I think he really does a good job of portraying Eva Smith in that way, which helps portray himself as this knight in shining armor. And what he's really doing here is he's romanticizing the nature of their relationship to create a more positive impression of himself and to make us potentially, well, really the inspector for him, and for Sheila and for maybe the rest of the whole family, for it to seem much more forgiving. I would argue this is all a big play. He does show, the stage directions do show emotion, but I would argue it's really important to look at his emotion at the end of the play to decide whether we think those emotions are real. So when he is speaking of Eva Smith, he does show signs of regret, right? He speaks in a low, troubled tone. He speaks gravely. He might just be capable of human compassion. However, in great contrast, his demeanor is very, very different at the end of the play. He's celebratory. He's smiling. He's triumphant. He feels like he's won. So you have to question the authenticity of Gerald's earlier emotions. And there's many ways. You could say he did feel those emotions, but he felt them in just a moment. And because at the core of him, he's this capitalist. At the core of him, he's a selfish being. At the core of him, he's a patriarch, right? That he just can't help but put himself first. So maybe it was real emotion, but it just doesn't last very long. Or you could argue he put it on, and it was really to manipulate everyone in the room, including the inspector, to so that he could leave. When he comes back, and I didn't put the details of this, but just a reminder, he offers the argument that Eva Smith is not one person. There are all different girls because no one got to see the photo together. But if you break that down, I don't want to spend too much time on this, it's so flawed. It's highly likely that Eva Smith is the same girl, right? And just looking at Gerald and what he says about her, he says that she's from the Brumley area. She was in a factory and she lost her job. She was at a shop, she lost her job, and all the rest. And I'm like, okay, so you just happened to meet someone else who had exactly the same experience? Unlikely. So it's highly likely that she's the same person. And what he doesn't get is it doesn't matter if it's the same person or not. However, Mrs. Burling says you've argued this most cleverly. And I would say, I don't know if she agrees and believes his argument, or she realizes what he's doing and she's saying, you've been very clever, well done. That's a great way to present that argument, okay? But what it does do at least is show that, you know, that adverb cleverly underlines his calculating nature. It's not about getting to the truth for him. It's about getting away with it. And so what we realise is he did not leave the house to self-reflect. He wasn't so overcome with emotion, he just wants to sit there and weep over the tragedy of Eva Smith. What he did do is he spent that time figuring out a way of how can he get out of this scandal, right? He goes to the inspector, he goes to question a police officer about the inspector, and then he starts to think, well, how can I figure out a way to say this isn't the same person? So for me, well, I think it's obvious he's a static character. I think that's hard to argue any other way. He does not show any real character development, and I would support that with, by the end, he says to Sheila, everything's all right now, Sheila, and he holds up the ring. That declarative sentence saying everything's all right really pinpoints that Gerald has not had any sign of character development. That engagement ring, you could argue, is a symbol of the patriarchal system. It's a symbol of power and possession. And so what you could interpret is that this is really Gerald attempting to reinstate the power imbalance in their relationship and regain control. He's lost a lot of control over Sheila over the course of this play, and I would argue this is his attempt to get that back. And this reiterates Priestley's argument that the upper class have every intention of holding on to the economic and social systems in place and holding on to their power, essentially. And then I've just included this, which is Mr. Burling's quote from the beginning of the play: a man has to make his own way, has to look after himself. And I would argue that Gerald's actions by the end of the play create a cyclical structure, because what we see are the beliefs of Mr. Burling in this quote echoed in the actions of Gerald by the end. So it's just this massive cycle. No one's learned anything. Everything that everyone was talking about at the beginning, Gerald is certainly displaying those beliefs by the end. So regardless of whether, and you can certainly interpret that he had a genuine connection with Eva Smith, that is a possible interpretation, but I would argue whether he had that genuine connection or not almost doesn't matter. What matters is, by the end of the play, his ultimate focus is self-preservation. He doesn't care about Eva Smith in that moment or what he's done. He cares about avoiding a public scandal, or at least having anything to do with it. So through his selfishness, Priestley encourages the audience to have a deep distrust of the upper class. So remember, when you come to your conclusion, don't just give an overview of what you just said. The examiner got it, right? Don't patronize the examiner. They don't need to hear it a second time. What you need to do is bring it all together to think, well, what are the main points that Priestley was trying to say through Gerald's character? For me, I think there's three things. I think he wanted to expose the upper class and highlight how exploitative they are, how selfish they are, and how dishonest they are. I think he also wanted to say, you know, the upper class has the most to lose by change, and therefore they will be the hardest to convert. And capitalism causes the dehumanization of the working class. And I think maybe another one would be, if you want things to change, don't rely on the upper class to change anything. We're going to have to make that change happen. So as always, I hope that was helpful. These are just my ideas. Please feel free to share your own ideas. There are so many different quotations that you could use for Gerald, and so many different ways to interpret him. So please feel free to share those in the comments section. And if you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to me, Mrs. Rumsey at mrsrumsey.com.